My name is Chitra Raghavan, and I'm a professor of psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I'll be talking about sexual coercion. Historically, what we've studied has been stranger rape and to some extent acquaintance rape. While acquaintance rape is gaining a great deal of importance in the field, our models of how we understand rape and sexual assault are still wedded to the more traditional models of stranger rape. Yet what evidence suggests is that most rapes or most sexual assaults or coercive unwanted sexual encounters happen between people who know each other, sometimes quite well, often married, and rarely use force. The way we can tell the difference between sexual coercion and unwanted sex is having very clear definitions and establishing boundaries and limits insofar as we can. Now, the difficulty lies in how we used to define or how we primarily define sexual assault and rape, which is either using a legalistic definition, so that should be force, threat of force, or incapacitation. And this often bleeds into the common understanding of sexual assault and correspondingly the resistance that the general public, sometimes scholars believe, is intrinsic to defining sexual assault. That is, women should resist violently or resist verbally or say no in very clear, explicit terms. So that's part of the controversy. Now, if we understand that sexual relationships are about negotiation, however we define negotiation, one way that I and some of my colleagues define it is coercion happens when negotiation ends. When the negotiating party no longer expects a reply, doesn't expect any advancement in the communication process, no rebuttal, no discussion, but simply pressures and pressures without any realistic expectation of a reply or negotiation, that's when we define it as sexual coercion. The first, perhaps most fundamental difference is the victim or the target is known to the perpetrator. These are people who are involved in a relationship. Sometimes it's a date, sometimes it's several dates, sometimes it's a long-term relationship, frequently it's marriage. The most fundamental difference is they're known to each other. The second difference, which really is a function of the first, is there's a history of sexual precedence. In other words, they've had sex. And once you've had sex, the transactional power, the negotiation, how sex is enacted changes completely. And that's another very important difference. The third is the access to the women. If you know the person, if you've had sex with him or her before, then the access to the women tends to be more in sort of daily sorts of things. If it's a dating relationship, perhaps you negotiate where to go out. If you're living together, well, the negotiations, or rather the opportunities for sex are very different. So really it's in the sexual precedence, the history of the relationship, and the access to the women. Emotionally or dynamically, a significant difference is how unwanted sex is acquired by someone who's known to the victim. And here is perhaps the most difficult and under-researched area. The data suggests that it's a mixture of manipulation, sweet talk, begging, blackmail, demanding sex through a sense of obligation, reminding the person that they've had sex, unfair trading, and using vulnerabilities that can only be known to someone in a long-term or an intimate relationship. So how sex is acquired is very different. There's rarely force, although there can be force. There's rarely direct threats of force, although I will argue that there are certainly implicit threats of force. So these would be the fundamental differences. Do we believe in universal models? Do we think that the dynamic of how people communicate and therefore how they miscommunicate is the same across male, 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 female, culture, and age? I, for one, do not. I think the way people communicate is very much entrenched in what the cultural laws set up, and also the person's understanding of how power is transacted and particular gender roles. So once we work with that assumption, then it follows for me that the models of violence cannot be universal. That is not to say there isn't overlap. That is not to say that they don't, in some ways, look alike. But I think we can't assume that they do until we've understood what the rules are of a particular set of interactions. This is very preliminary, but I've been working on same-sex violence for a couple of years now, and again, it's very preliminary, but my data is starting to suggest that the items don't load together the same way that they load together for male-to-female violence. We're not seeing the same distinctions of major-minor violence. We're certainly not seeing the same emotional coercive dynamics. Now, again, it's preliminary. It could be the measures that I used. It could be my particular sample. But, you know, I think if we understand or believe that power is different between people for a number of different reasons, then by definition, the abuse of that power is going to be different.